They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when victory comes at the cost of innocence? When the flag raised for liberty becomes the banner of massacre? In the long shadow of America's Civil War, when freedom was being fought for in the East, another story was unfolding far out on the plains of Colorado. A story that would stain the conscience of a nation forever. Hey, you're watching Echoing Westwinds, the channel where we bring forgotten stories of the American frontier back to life. And before we begin, I want to hear your thoughts. When you learn about tragedies like this, do you think America's darker past should be remembered for its lessons? Or forgiven as history? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every one. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, make sure to subscribe. It helps keep Echoing Westwinds alive. Because today, we're uncovering one of the darkest moments in the history of the United States Army, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, when over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people were slaughtered under the promise of peace. This wasn't a battle, it was a betrayal. Before the attack. To understand how this horror began, we have to go back to the 1850s, a decade when the American frontier was still a vast, untamed expanse stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rockies. The Cheyenne and Arapaho nations lived freely across this land, their villages scattered across the high plains of what is now Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska. In 1851, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, recognizing native land stretching from the North Platte River to the Arkansas. For a moment, there was peace, a fragile line drawn in the dust between settlers and tribes. But then, as always, came gold. When the Pikes Peak Gold Rush erupted in 1858, thousands of prospectors flooded Colorado territory. They dug, mined, cut, and claimed. And in their hunger for wealth, they ignored the treaty lines entirely. The Cheyenne watched as the buffalo herds vanished, rivers ran muddy with waste, and the land they called home was overrun by strangers. The U.S. government's answer was not to honor its word, but to shrink it. In 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wise was signed, reducing Cheyenne and Arapaho territory to a fraction, just 1/13 of what they had been promised. It was signed by only a handful of chiefs, under pressure, confusion, and false promises. And those who didn't sign, the Dog Soldiers, the fiercest of Cheyenne warriors, called it what it was, a betrayal. They swore never to honor it. And the cycle of violence began. By 1864, small raids and skirmishes broke out between settlers and warrior bands. But while some Cheyennes sought war, others still hoped for peace. Chiefs like Black Kettle, White Antelope, and Left Hand believed diplomacy could save their people. They met with U.S. officials carrying peace medals and letters from President Lincoln himself, declaring them friends of the government. But on the frontier, politics didn't matter. Only power did. And the man who held that power was Colonel John Chivington, a former preacher turned soldier commanding the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. To his men, he was a hero from the Battle of Glorieta Pass. To the Cheyenne, he would become something far worse. Chivington was desperate for glory, for another victory to carry him into politics after the war. He had no sympathy for native tribes. He once said publicly, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right to do so." And in 1864, he would get his chance. The attack. That autumn, Governor John Evans of Colorado Territory called for all friendly tribes to gather near Fort Lyon. There, he promised they would be safe. The message was simple. Come to the fort, raise the American flag, and no harm will come to you. Black Kettle believed him. He brought hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and elders, to a site along Big Sandy Creek. They built camp. They raised the stars and stripes above their lodges, and they waited for the peace they'd been promised. But Evans and Chivington had other plans. While the peace seekers settled, Chivington's men prepared for war. He gathered more than 700 soldiers, including the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, known bitterly by locals as the Bloodless Third, because they had yet to see battle. They wanted blood, and Chivington promised to deliver it. On the cold dawn of November 29, 1864, the soldiers rode out from Fort Lyon under the cover of darkness. As they neared the camp, they saw the white tents glinting in the pale morning light, the flags of peace still fluttering in the wind. Captain Silas Soule, one of Chivington's officers, saw the truth immediately. He knew these weren't enemy warriors. These were families. He begged Chivington to stand down, but the colonel refused. His words were simple: "Take no prisoners." At sunrise, the first cannon roared, and Sand Creek erupted into chaos. The soldiers charged through the village, firing blindly. Teepees burned, horses screamed, and the air filled with smoke and dust. Women clutched their children and ran for the dry riverbed, waving white flags, pleading for mercy, but there was none. Eyewitnesses would later say that the soldiers fired on anything that moved. Men, women, babies, all cut down without hesitation. The air reeked of gunpowder and blood. One survivor, a young Cheyenne girl, later told how her mother covered her with her own body. When the gunfire stopped, she was alive. Her mother was not. Black Kettle stood outside his lodge, holding the American flag high above his head. It had been given to him by a U.S. general as a promise of protection. He believed, even then, that the soldiers would see it and stop. They didn't. The bullets tore through the fabric and through the people beneath it. White Antelope, another elder chief, stepped forward and cried out, "Stop! Stop! We are friends!" Those were his last words before he was gunned down. The massacre lasted hours. When the smoke cleared, over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho lay dead, most of them women and children. Bodies were mutilated, scalps taken as trophies. Some soldiers even paraded the severed limbs of their victims through the streets of Denver days later, claiming they'd won a great victory. One soldier, testifying later before Congress, said, "I saw the bodies of those lying there, cut all to pieces. The women cut up worse than any I ever saw before. Their brains knocked out, babies shot or beaten to death by the United States troops." It was no battle. It was slaughter. After the attack. By nightfall, the few survivors crept out from the riverbed. They walked for days, bleeding and hungry, to warn the others up north. Among them was Black Kettle, still alive, though his wife had been shot 9 times. The news spread like wildfire across the plains. To the native nations, Sand Creek was proof that the white man's peace could never be trusted. The Dog Soldiers vowed revenge, and the Great Plains soon burned in retaliation raids from Colorado to Kansas. But even among the settlers, not everyone stayed silent. Captain Silas Soule, the man who refused to fire on civilians, wrote detailed letters describing the atrocity, the killings, the mutilations, the lies. His words reached Washington, and Congress launched an investigation. Their conclusion was damning. In 1865, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War declared, "Wearing the uniform of the United States, Colonel Chivington deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre. He murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children of Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe they were under the protection of the government." But justice never came. Chivington resigned before he could be court-martialed. He lived the rest of his life as a free man, even admired by some in Colorado who called him a hero. Captain Soule, the man who told the truth, was assassinated on the streets of Denver just weeks later. His killer was never convicted. Legacy. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Sand Creek was more than a massacre. It was a wound that never healed. The survivors scattered. Some joined the Sioux and Dog Soldiers, striking back in waves of vengeance. Others, like Black Kettle, continued to seek peace, until he too was killed 4 years later at the Battle of Washita River in another so-called military victory. The U.S. government promised reparations under the Little Arkansas Treaty: land, money, safety. None of it ever came. Instead, the survivors were forced south into what would become Oklahoma. Their homelands gone forever. For decades, official history called it the Battle of Sand Creek. A battle, as if both sides had fought. As if 200 unarmed people could fight back against cannons and rifles. It wasn't until the 20th century that the truth began to resurface, through descendants, historians, and the few soldiers who dared to speak of what they'd done. Today, the Sand Creek Massacre site stands as a national historic landmark. The prairie is quiet now, wind brushing through the grass, the creek still running shallow through the sand. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes. The voices that were silenced, whispering through the plains. A reminder of what happens when humanity is lost in the name of progress. And that's the story of the Sand Creek Massacre, one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American frontier. A moment when flags of peace were trampled under boots of betrayal, and where the echoes of injustice still haunt the land. Before you go, I want to ask you again, when you hear stories like this, do you think the past should be remembered for its lessons, or forgiven and left behind?
Tell me in the comments. I read each one.
And if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to live on, subscribe to Echoing Westwinds, where we uncover the truth buried beneath the dust of history.
Because remembering isn't just about the past.
It's about who we choose to be now.